Peggy Murray. I'm happy to be here this morning. I direct the Global Alcohol Research Program at NIH, the National Institutes of Health in the United States. I've been a member of the forum for 6 years, and a number of NIH institutes support this forum. It's been very, very helpful to us as we negotiate the public health implications of violence. And as most of you are aware, alcohol is certainly involved in every aspect of violence. We haven't found one yet where it's not a factor, an important factor. So this morning we have, to start off, 3 speakers who will address in a general way the 3 main themes of the workshop that Louise just went through. As a former professor of policy, I have to say that one of the things that will be on my mind throughout these 2 days is the fact that how do you get violence on the policy agenda? The agenda is full, it's overflowing, it always is. So it's important that we look at ways to get it on the agenda and get it in a prominent place on the agenda so that it gets the attention of policymakers. So with that, we're going to go with our first speaker, Andres Villaveces from the World Bank, who will talk about economics and the costing case for public policy and violence prevention. And the full biographies of all the speakers you can find in the materials that were handed out at the beginning.
Microphone? Okay, yes, it works. Well, thank you very much for this kind invitation. What I'm going to do in this short period of time is talk a little bit more about the strategy and follow a little bit upon the question that Dr. Murray just posed, which is, with a full agenda, how do you go about, or what are the challenges that you are confronted with? Using, in this particular case, or focusing a little bit more on the economic components, and without disregarding the other 2 issues that are indeed essential. A lot of the examples or some of the thoughts that I will provide are based on work that goes on at the World Bank. The bank is an institution that relies very much on economic indicators. It creates a lot of economic indicators. But surprisingly, in the topic of violence, it lacks a lot of them. It lacks an amazing amount of information. Yet, in devising a global strategy for violence prevention that the bank has now, and in devising a set of activities and activities in countries, we are confronted on a case-by-case with countries and a case-by-case basis with the challenge of, well, how do we justify this? And how do we justify it from an economic perspective? There are indeed many other arguments, social, environmental, health, many arguments, but the economic one is really important, especially at an institution such as the bank. So what is needed for making a case? I most likely will omit some things, and you will probably want to complement this throughout the workshop. But obviously, the arguments about the importance of preventing violence are really important, and there are a whole set of arguments that range from moral to more objective in terms of cost and in terms of damage. You need data. You need data about violence and data about costs of violence. You need to know what to do, the types of interventions, and how to do those interventions. And to do that, you need to understand in what settings you are actually trying to make the case for a particular policy. If you want to work in a particular country in a setting that is a local setting, where the main authority is the mayor of a town, you can strategize and you can focus on a particular type of policymaker, which will be different in other countries where, even though there is a mayor, the mayor might not have the entire policy or economic decision-making strategy. So a lot of the how-to and understanding the place and the context where the policy or the case is going to be made is really essential. That is obviously linked to how the place works, what is missing in the particular context, and so understanding how you might implement this and what the costs associated to it are really important. And to do this, obviously, a really proper communication strategy is essential. So I take these arguments from a publication that the WHO and EDC did some time ago. You can have arguments that support basic human rights, that address disease and health, that address societal factors and how they intersect with other sectors or with other parts of society. You can make an argument, which is at the World Bank, one of perhaps the most used argument, which is if you don't address violence, you are hampering development. Some people have said, when you let violence happen, you can actually have development in reverse. You can have situations in countries that are at some stage, and that in the event of a chronic or a massive exposure of violence can actually backtrack several years the whole situation of economic development. And of course it can improve revenues either by having a more functional society, or simply by by preventing the diversion of costs that go to violence into other areas that improve society in general. Their social context and political context is important also, because you have sometimes conflicting information. I choose the topic of firearms here. It's very relevant, for example, to the United States, where a lot of studies have been done addressing the direct costs of violence, the indirect costs of violence, which are staggering. We know that are incredible costs, and we know that preventing firearm-related violence is really important and would save a lot of lives and a lot of money. It would improve probably other areas of health and society if we actually didn't have this problem. But there are a lot of legislative, of constitutional, and of general societal norms that prevent this from being addressed from all possible ways. And there are competing economic interests also. So this is important. It's important. I'm selecting this topic because it's more salient, it's easier to address, but this applies to many other countries, not only firearms. You can talk about alcohol. How do you address the issue of alcohol? Typically, and some people who have actually tried to implement policies on that level here in this particular venue, have encountered that there are opposing interests that will argue with economic costs also against a particular intervention that we know is preventative. So understanding that context is really important for framing a particular message, and I'm sure the communication component will be addressed in much more eloquent way soon. We also have different situations. In the case, I'll give you two examples. At the World Bank, for example, we know, and the country of El Salvador has a huge problem with violence. They have the highest rates of homicide in the world. They have currently higher rates than what they had when they were at the top of the civil war that they had several years ago. They have more homicides right now, and they understand how this is hampering society at all levels. Economic investment is impaired, educational issues are impaired, work opportunities, security in general, the well-being of the population is hampered. So the country knows that violence is a big problem. And the country has approached an institution like the World Bank and said, we need a loan, we need a lot of money, but you need to help us use this money in a proper way. So in some contexts, a particular setting, we don't need to make a case for violence or for addressing violence. What we need to do is we need to make a case for the proper investment of the resources that exist, and for the most effective investment of resources that exist, so that violence will be prevented in a way better than other ways. So we have a myriad of interventions that we can apply, but we need to think economically about what are the best places and the best actions and the best interventions for that particular setting, so that violent prevention activities will be developed progressively and over time. So this is, and it's very different from the initial question that Dr. Murray had, which is, well, if you need to make a case, but you have a full agenda, sometimes the top of the agenda is violence. But when you have a full agenda that is competing, take the case of Belize. They have a lot of issues related to health and infectious diseases, to surveillance, to transportation problems, to education problems, to other health issues, to disaster and risk management issues, and violence is also a problem. So you come to the country and say, well, you know, we need to argue violence is a big problem. You come with costing information, look how it affects youth, look how it affects children. Here is information from other countries, yet it remains third, fourth of the agenda, and perhaps is the first topic to be dropped because, well, transport is a bigger issue right now. And so we need to create this. So policymakers many times will rely on or will make decisions based on, well, what can I show better or faster? That's an important, it's not the only, but it's an important decision-making sort of criterion that sometimes is applied. And sometimes preventing violence does not address that. You can't see the changes that easily as you can when you build an infrastructure or a physical infrastructure of a particular setting. That is also reflected in the investments that the World Bank has. The investments in transportation and in building things are humongous compared to the investments in social development. Progressively, the bank has been learning as an institution that investing in social development is important and is really key to address other issues. But still there's a huge difference. And so the strategy that you should follow is very different on how you frame your message, one based on what is the best way where having this opportunity I can invest versus how can I convince these policymakers that this is an issue they should invest in. So those are very different strategies, but very real in many places. You obviously have many costing methods. You will, and typically one of the most important ones that are used or taken into account at the bank are the cost-benefit type of analysis. When you want to delve more in the implementation part, you obviously look at the cost effectiveness and then comparing different opportunities, you can look at cost minimization. I am not going to talk a lot about the quality of the data, but I do want to say that there is a huge disparity of measures. There's a huge amount of information that is missing in regards to the costs of violence. There's a huge disparity in the way things are defined. When you look at indirect costs, there was a study done, I think it was in 2004 or 3, maybe the Hugh Waters study, something like that on the costs of implementing violence. And it relied mostly on very thorough analyses that were conducted in countries, in high-income countries mostly. And it looked at direct costs. With the direct costs, there were discrepancies, despite a clear definition. When you come to indirect costs, you can have a huge range of different levels of information because there is no consensus in the way things are defined. So in your messaging, it's important to account for this because you can have counter arguments that use the same concepts but with different measures. And so your estimates can appear very different from the estimates of someone who's doing a counter argument. I recall also a matrix of cost that was using traditional cost versus the ecologic matrix that was done here at this venue when at the IOM in 2012 that took into account costs at the individual, family, community level, etc. So there are different ways of creating and of framing your costs that are important, that when one needs to make the case, one needs to really take into account as a strategy what is the best use of those arguments for a particular setting. There is obviously calculated costs, and this data is questionable. It's been calculated using a lot of information, but like I said at the beginning, because of the lack of clarity of information, some people argue these are huge overestimates of what's happening. In the case of child abuse, estimated as $3.6 trillion. The cost of child abuse, about 4.2% of the GDP, and the cost of child homicide is about 0.44% of the global GDP. So these are some data calculated based on a lot of studies. But again, the methodologies are not standardized. Perhaps they shouldn't be, but the problem is that given the existence of so many definitions and so many lax definitions, perhaps in the case of addressing costs, direct or indirect, then we have a huge variety of results that make and model this information. That when the information exists. When the information doesn't exist, which is in the majority of the cases, is extremely difficult. At the World Bank, sometimes we find ourselves just arguing with rates of events, or the prevalence of events, or the incidence of an event, and saying, well, indirectly saying, well, this is affecting youth, and youth are the most economically active, and that's where the economic argument ends, because there are no data to back that up. For a country like Jordan, for example, where we want to address this, there's a huge influx of refugees and immigrants, and there's a huge increase in violence, and so, but there are no data. So the strategy and the messaging is really important. Again, just showing you, if you strategize and if you sort of frame your data in a different way, in this case I'm focusing on non-fatal intimate partner violence, you can argue for a particular region that the problem is much bigger for that region than for another region. And so if you're interested in a particular setting, you might want to frame your argument based on a particular subtopic of violence. If you look at violence overall, you will see that the biggest problem is occurring in Latin America. But when you disaggregate it as intimate partner violence, or in the case of child abuse and neglect, child abuse, you will find that Africa and the Middle Eastern region are worse off. And so you might want to use your information to argue economic, or put economic arguments to make a case. What I'm saying, and I mean, and this is something that we typically do without the necessity of obviously inventing data, but using the highest possible and available quality of data, we frame our information from an economic perspective so as to achieve a goal that we want, which is a particular investment in violence prevention. You can also compare it. Well, look at the staggering difference between interpersonal violence in the home versus the cost of civil war and terrorism, given the magnitude of the problem, given all the situation or the prevalence of this problem that exists. And so you can make arguments by comparing like that. And in fact, we do that a lot. You can look at benefit to cost ratios, and you can argue that well, putting peacekeeping troops in dealing with conflict, for every $1 investment you get 5 out, but if you prevent physical assaults, you get a much better rate of return. You get $17 back from every $1 that you invest. Or for child abuse, for every $1 that you invest, you get 11 back. And so using these arguments is really based and is really modulated in a whole part by the context and by to whom you are giving that message, to whom that message is relevant. If I'm giving this message to the head of a nation state, the message perhaps is going to be different than if I'm giving it to the mayor of a small or medium-sized town that has a serious problem of violence in 2 or 3 neighborhoods. I want to use different costs, different framing of economic information, and so that is essential in this particular case. In the same venue, economic information is also important from the perspective of, well, where am I going to get all these resources? In the case of El Salvador that I mentioned, that was a loan that they were asking to the World Bank. It was a $110 million loan that they were asking for the World Bank. But you can get that information, and many times when you do and pose the economic arguments, you will say, well, okay, give me the money. Through a grant or through a particular donor. What is the format in which the resources to implement this are going to happen? So in the messaging, in making the case, I think it's also important to make the case about where the resources are going to come from and who is going to provide them. I think that is really important also to take into account. And there I include also civil society organizations, the private sectors, or different combinations of government and non-government type of approaches. This thing, oh, there we go, okay. So some key issues to consider are the political and legal and social relevance of the issue. The economic arguments, pro and con, are really important. It's important to understand the argument, the counter arguments that can exist from an economical perspective. In the case of alcohol, it's very clear. How are you going to affect the business people who sell alcohol? In the case of guns, that's also an issue. In the case of, in some cases, it's more clear-cut than others. It is easier to make the case for investing in child abuse and not having counter-arguments for that than investing in controlling alcohol and not having counter-arguments for that, because you will have more counter-arguments for that. There's also evidence that the sooner, the famous Heckman curve, I had put it here, but I don't know what happened, but the earlier you invest in life using a human capital approach, the earlier you invest in life, the more returns you get over time. So you can use a lot of these arguments to pose that information. So the evidence on costs is important. The information on costs is relevant, but it needs to be framed in a very proper context-oriented way. And we need to understand that given the disparity and the differences in costs and in the way costs are framed by different people, we can have very serious arguments, or our economic argument could be weakened if we don't frame that properly. Where to invest is another issue. Should I invest in infrastructure, in data infrastructure? What do I invest in first? My messaging is important from an economic perspective there. Should I invest in capacity building or directly in policies aimed at devising interventions or at overall institutional strengthening so that more efficient existing processes can be improved? What are the costs of implementation at the national or the local level? Should there be an intersectoral or not an intersectoral approach? And what is the role of other sectors? These are all issues that need to be embedded in the economic messaging in order to be more effective. In the end, you will sometimes have to convince perhaps one person, perhaps a group of persons. And that type of convincing sometimes doesn't necessarily have to be using economic arguments, but rather a combination of information, of economic arguments, and proper communication. With this last slide, I just open for my other colleagues who will address the other issues of evidence and communication. But as a starter, just wanted to show you that mostly the strategy for thinking on about the economic use or the use of economic arguments is really crucial to actually get a particular policy to become effective. If you don't understand the context and what are the needs of the person that you want to have an influence upon, then it's going to be much harder to make that change. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are going to have a discussion session at the end, but we do have some extra time, which is always good. If anybody has a clarification question. Yes.
Can you talk about, I know it's hard to estimate. I'm Peter Nye. Is the microphone working? Yeah, I'm Peter Nye. I know it's hard to estimate the cost because there's so many factors. One thing that I wonder about is when you end a person's life at a certain age, how do you take account of what's the probable consequence of ending the person's life at that age, and sort of what's the cost? And I hate to say benefit, but consequence, I'll say, because that's a word that indicates that it includes either cost and or benefit. How do you estimate that?
Well, I was just talking with Alex just before this presentation about a measure that looks at the cost per disability adjusted life year, right? So you have a life expectancy in a particular society, and a life is ended earlier than expected. And there are some years that are lost. But there are also some years that if the person doesn't lose their life, there are some years that are lost in the sense that there is a disability. And you can calculate the cost like that to get an estimate of what is the burden overall to society in those terms. It's not the only way. There are multiple ways of calculating this information. It sounds sometimes cold, as you mentioned, because you're assigning a particular cost. But what is important to understand is this is an average estimation. It obviously doesn't relate to the cost of a life, but an average estimation of the cost to society. And so using the disability adjusted life years, in other cases just the life years lost, which is a more incomplete measure, then those estimates can be sort of calculated, and those estimates can also be monetized in a sense, and so you can come up with an estimate that makes some sense. Again, here is really important. What is really key is when you do that, is that you need to very properly define your rationale and how is it that you're coming to that particular conclusion. Very frequently, this type of definition and criteria that you're using to come up with a conclusion are not properly defined in discussions, and so it can become very contentious at times. So just to say, there are multiple measures. Some of these disability adjusted life years are useful because they're very specific. They rely on information that is readily available from different countries, independent of their development, and then you can actually estimate the cost based on that.